Well, thank you guys for joining us for Resolve Foundation for the COVID-19 Vaccine Awareness Seminar. We are the Resolve Foundation and we're sponsoring this event, so thank you. Resolve, just a little bit about Resolve first. We are a nonprofit organization. We try to promote civic engagement and social awareness in young people. So we've tried to create several programs to help invest in people and organizations, to educate young people, to help drive social change. We are trying to help them improve kind of their health outcomes, their social outcomes, and financial well-being. If you do want to learn more about us, we are on pretty much all the social medias out there, so please follow. But you can also learn more about us on resolvefoundation.org. Despite the pandemic, we are still trying to focus on our goals. We want to focus on helping young people, and during the pandemic, that has only increased. So in 2020, we've seen that many families are struggling to help support their children, help support their education due to missing technical needs or financial needs, let alone health issues. So we have sought new ways to help people during the pandemic, and this webinar is one of them. Our goal for today would be to speak about the health impacts of COVID-19, to kind of review some of those impacts, especially in young people, and then to bring awareness into the vaccine itself and how it could be helpful getting us to normal life. We have two incredibly accomplished speakers for you today, Dr. Robert Murphy and Dr. Stephen Weber. But before I get into introducing them, I'll have Ihoma speak to you a little bit about the housekeeping and technical stuff and how you can.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today. Just a few housekeeping tips today. If everyone can please mute their microphones. And we definitely want to hear from you. So if you have any questions, please enter them into the chat section, and our Q&A will be at the end of the webinar. So thank you, and I'll turn it back over to you, Steve.
All right. So first, I'm going to introduce Dr. Stephen Weber. Currently, he is the Chief Medical Officer and Senior Vice President for Clinical Excellence at University of Chicago. He's also the Professor of Medicine and Infectious Disease in the Infectious Disease and Global Health Department there. He oversees clinical quality and patient safety at the large academic center at the south side of Chicago, as you guys all well know. And he also has his own patients. He has kind of both inpatients and outpatients that he sees regularly. Previously, before this role, he served as the Chief Healthcare Epidemiologist and Medical Director of Infectious Control at University of Chicago. So welcome, Dr. Weber.
Steve, thanks very much, and thanks to the Resolve Foundation for bringing us together today, and really appreciate the audience joining us. I know for those of us in Chicago, it's about the first nice day we've had on the weekend in a while, so we appreciate you staying in with us for this important topic. I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction. Our aim today is to try to answer your questions. Some have already come up in advance and some we want to have in the session. But what we'll do is I'm going to spend just a few minutes setting the stage around the pandemic. And we're all familiar with it to varying degrees, but just to provide a little context about where we're at now, how we got here. And then I'll pass to Dr. Murphy, who's going to take us a little bit deeper into the vaccines, because we know that's really front of everyone's mind right now. We're kind of sick of the rest of it and eager to get to the vaccine. For a lot of us in the business, this is something that we've been working on for a long time. Steve mentioned my previous role in leading the infection control program at the University of Chicago, something I did back to 2002 and 2003. And at that time, we would periodically gather and meet with other institutions, departments of public health, and do simulations and tabletop drills to prepare for the threat of what we then would call an unknown airborne respiratory virus pandemic. I mean, we did this again and again over the years, and it really got built into our systems in so many ways, and it played out from there. It played out on how we organize as a health system, how we interact with departments of public health, and included up to and including even how hospitals are built nowadays. So when you look around the Chicago area alone, Northwestern, Rush, University of Chicago, all of us who've built new buildings in the last 10 or 15 years, and a lot of us have really been building them with the notion of saying, what if this happens and how will we be prepared for it? So it's not lost on me as I describe that you'd think with 2 decades of preparation, things might have gone even more smoothly. And I'll confess that it leads to a lot of frustration above and beyond all the human suffering, because I look back to many of those discussions, many of those plans, and it's a reminder that plans are essential, but it's really how we execute around it and how we align as communities, as providers, and as a society to do so. And I know they'll be talking about that for decades to come with respect to what went on with the pandemic. But what do we see and what have we seen? In the Chicago area, where a lot of you may be joining from, we saw this early spring surge and then a flattening in pandemic cases in the summer, and then another surge as we moved into the fall. All the while, as both a society and as a healthcare profession, we've gotten better at managing this. And I'm not setting aside any of the controversy, frustration, and recriminations that have come tied into a lot of political issues, but even just how we think about getting testing out to communities, particularly underserved communities, communities of color, how we think about access to care. I'm reminded when people talk about, boy, in this pandemic, we've really seen that access to care is limited and that outcomes can be worse for underserved communities or people of color. And I always have to remind people and say, yeah, the pandemic is like every other disease and health condition in that way. And I think there's no silver lining to something like this. But if we've exposed and educated a broader set of people about the inequities that come about in healthcare and care delivery in the US right now, again, it's not a silver lining, but it's something that we can come away as a society. But as we've gone forward, we've gotten better at getting the testing out. We've collectively gotten better in caring for individuals and getting access to care. But nonetheless, the toll has been astonishing. And I don't need to repeat the statistics for this group: over 500,000 Americans now dead, and obviously a global impact of this disease. As we've gone forward, we've been waiting since last year for the light at the end of the tunnel, the vaccines that might come and might bring a close to the pandemic. And Dr. Murphy will say more about that in a moment. But in the meanwhile, we've come to understand as well the empowering effect of what we can do to try to prevent transmission long before an inoculation is put into our arm. And so the engagement, and sometimes the costly engagement, around social distancing, around personal protective equipment and masks. I know there'll be more questions about those when we get into questions and answer, but I think it's probably materially changed how we think about our own healthcare as we go forward. You know, one of the most interesting statistics of the pandemic so far for me is at the University of Chicago, in our health system, we just saw our 3rd case of influenza for the whole winter. It's a reminder that the choices and decisions and the policies we put in place do have an impact. So in this case, very little influenza, probably as a consequence of a lot of other things that we've been doing and working on together. So again, there's a lot to get into the questions and answers for sure as we go forward. We want to stick to the topics that are most interesting to you. But Steve, I'll pass it back to you to introduce Dr. Murphy. And I think he's going to take us, like I said, a little deeper dive on the vaccine. I think that'll set the stage for some great discussion.
Oh man, that's crazy. Thank you so much. Yeah, I definitely have not seen a flu in the emergency department just yet. And, you know, we have these rapid tests now where that can test you for, you know, the 2 flus, COVID and RSV, and it's always COVID. So that's very interesting. Well, thank you. So next up is Dr. Robert Murphy. Currently, he is the Executive Director of the Institute of Global Health and John P. Phair Professor of Infectious Disease. He's also a Professor of Medicine and Biomedical Engineering at Northwestern University. Interestingly, originally his interests focused on viral infections. He sought to develop new antiviral drugs and vaccines for patients who suffered from HIV and viral hepatitis, both in the United States and sub-Saharan Africa. He also served as a scientific laboratory director at the University of Bamako in Mali during the West African Ebola outbreak from a few years ago. He also led several NIH-supported initiatives to develop point-of-care testing for devices that treat, monitor, and prevent HIV and their associated diseases and conditions of Africa. And then that project actually frame shifted a little bit. And then he was using that project to help develop diagnostic assays and devices for COVID-19 through the $1.5 billion NIH grant that helps support that. That grant is called the Rapid Acceleration Diagnostics for COVID-19. and he actually serves as a board member, a review board member on that. So Dr. Murphy, welcome. It's your time to speak.
Thank you very much for inviting me here. I always forget to do that. I'm sorry. It's a pleasure to be here. So to put it into perspective, there are, regarding the vaccines that Steve has already brought up, there's actually 99 vaccines that are in clinical trials right now at all the different stages. And there are probably 50 others in the preclinical stages, just the animal and testing stages. And there's an additional 4 that have basically been abandoned because they didn't work. So there is a lot of activity in the vaccine area. If you look at the number of people that have taken the vaccines, right now in the United States, there's 47 million people who've actually taken at least 1 dose. And fully vaccinated, in other words, the 2 doses, is 22 million. So overall, 14.37% of Americans have taken the vaccine. If you put this into perspective worldwide, we're actually 4th in the world. So despite all the chaos we hear about, and the rollout of the vaccines has been nothing short of completely chaotic. However, within that chaos, we've actually delivered more vaccines than any other large developed country. So you've got to look at the entire picture. The #1 vaccinated country in the world right now is Israel. Israel is basically, it's a relatively small country, 7-8 million people, I believe, that, they are kind of geared for disasters at any particular time. And they've got a whole disaster relief and sort of a military-oriented healthcare operation, and they have really risen to the occasion. The United Arab Emirates also is very highly vaccinated, and so is the United Kingdom. The UK, I don't think people appreciated in this country what's going on in the United Kingdom. The UK in September noticed that they had a different kind of virus, what they call the B117 virus. It's much more easier to transmit, maybe as much as 50%. And in many of the studies, it's actually more lethal than the variant, the original variant. And you've heard a lot about these variants. They had also delayed a lot of their mitigation efforts, and they had really high rates until Boris Johnson got sick and in the hospital. And when he came out, he basically got religion about this and got very serious. And they are just shoving vaccine out the door. They've broken every rule that we know about vaccines. They give you one kind of vaccine, your booster's another kind of vaccine, your booster's maybe 3 months later, so that they can get more people this 1 dose, because you do get protection after 1 dose. And all that's good. They did everything very unorthodox. And they developed their own vaccine at Oxford, which I'll talk about later. So they're the 3rd most vaccinated country. And then comes us, our chaos. It's total chaos in the United States. We did great in developing the vaccines. I don't know about you, Steve, but when they said last summer that there was going to be a vaccine in 2020, I said, yeah, sure. It's never going to happen. My guess back in the summer was mid-2021. And thank God I'm wrong. And I'm the first to admit it. But the Operation Warp Speed, which is run by BARDA, a US agency, they did a very clever thing. They took the top 8 candidate vaccine makers and biotech companies, small ones too, and pre-purchased hundreds of millions of doses and also infused billions of dollars in development money to get this thing off the ground, thinking that the vaccines would be 50 or 60% effective, and that 1 or 2 of the 8 would make it. All those predictions were wrong. We did much better. There's really only the Merck vaccines have bombed out. They're gone. And the AstraZeneca one's got its problems. But other than that, the other ones are going gangbusters. And without that concerted effort, it never would have happened. However, that's where the organization kind of stopped. And the delivery of the vaccines has been nothing short of chaos, as I mentioned. But anyway, let's talk actually about the vaccines. So there's 12 actually vaccines that have some sort of approval in the world. We're not the only game in town worldwide. We have the Pfizer, we have the Moderna, which everyone is aware of. You heard Johnson & Johnson, the FDA review committee approved it yesterday. So we've got really hot new information. AstraZeneca is approved in the UK and Europe, and WHO approved. The Novavax is coming up probably at the end of the first quarter, beginning of second quarter here in the United States. And then the rest of them are Chinese, CanSino, Gamaleya in Russia, the Wuhan Institute in China, Beijing Institute, Sinovac China, Sinopharm China, Vector Institute Russia, and the Bharat biotech company in India. All have some kind of approval. So there's 12 companies out there making vaccines. Now, we have a shortage. So what's happening worldwide, I'm head of global health, so it's like, very global bent here. But keep in mind, if we don't control this thing globally, we will never control it here. So, it's got to be a global effort. Otherwise, we're just not going to work. So anyway, but all these vaccines going around worldwide. So the Russians and Chinese have cut deals with many, many middle income and low income countries already. Now, they're having the same problem that we have. They promise and then they can't deliver. So there's been all sorts of issues with these other vaccines. Let's go back and just talk about the ones, because I've seen the questions that you gave us last week. We've got our top candidates, as I already mentioned, and there's a couple different mechanisms of action. Let's start with the Pfizer, the first one off the block. So the Pfizer vaccine was actually developed by a really relatively small German biotech company called BioNTech. And they partnered with Pfizer. They're too small. I don't even know if they could have enough capacity to even deliver in Germany. But they partnered with Pfizer, good partnership. This is this new mRNA technology, not been used before. It's a new, novel technology. Remember, our initial thinking was that it was going to be 50–60% effective. The FDA was going to allow that. 95% efficacy. It's just, it's a grand slam home run. They hit the ball out of the park. What they does, this mRNA actually is injected. It's a very fragile small molecule. It's injected, it gets into the genome and tells the cell to make spike protein, which is the little red thing you see on all the cartoon pictures of the virus. And that's where the virus attaches. And it makes that, the body responds to it. The vaccine itself is gone from the body in about a day and a half. But the immune system is like massively triggered and makes these antibodies to this spike protein. And it's a very novel mechanism, and it turns out to be incredibly potent. It's a fragile virus. That's why the freezing requirements are so tight with both Pfizer and Moderna. The Pfizer in particular is even more fragile than the Moderna one. But anyway, the US pumped in $1.95 billion in pre-purchasing 100 million doses, and they've subsequently purchased more. It's got to be stored at minus 95 Fahrenheit at least. They recently have found out that this in a conventional freezer, it is stable for 14 days. This is just like, I think, 2 or 3 days ago. They figured that out and got FDA approval for that. That will help a lot. But they've done their homework. They built these special coolers that have 5,000 doses in them. It's good in the cooler, I think, for another 15 days. But once you thaw that out, it's only good for 6 hours. You probably heard some, running around, I got 2 doses left, who are you going to give it to? Give it to anybody. Don't throw it away. We got a shortage. So anyway, very effective. They had, and when I talk about effective, we're talking about studies with 44,000 people, placebo controlled. These are big, highly powered studies. So it's very effective. It's effective against the UK variant, the B117, but it is only marginally effective against the South African variant, B1351. So this is a problem. The other issue with this vaccine is that there have been reports, I'm sure you've heard about them, about anaphylaxis. Now, anaphylaxis in general from a vaccine has been reported in the past in like 1 in a million. And the Pfizer vaccine is 11.1 per million. So it's, basically 10 times more likely. But still, you're talking about, in 1 in 100,000 or 90,000 people getting anaphylaxis, and nobody has died of anaphylaxis. It's a short-lived phenomena, responds to epinephrine. It's a little concerning when I see people getting shots at Costco and stuff. If that does happen, I don't know what they're going to do. But it's not a common side effect, and that should not be slowing anything down. So that's the Pfizer vaccine. Israel has a lot of experience with it. They're the most vaccinated country. They started with the Pfizer one. They've had, of 523,000 people, only 15 required hospitalization. 15 out of 500,000 people. 8 mild, 3 moderate, 4 severe, no deaths. Not one person died. Can you imagine the impact that is having on the healthcare system, these vaccines? People are not hardly any going in the hospital and nobody dying compared to what's happening today. So it's really phenomenal. Moderna is the next one, also approved just a couple weeks after the Pfizer, same technology, different nanoparticle sheath around it. The cold chain requirement is not quite as strict. They got huge infusions of money. It was co-developed with the Vaccine Research Institute at the NIH. So Tony Fauci actually was one of the key drivers of this vaccine, but the company itself is based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. 2 doses, 4 weeks apart. The Pfizer is 3 weeks apart. That's an arbitrary number, really. Same efficacy. Slight difference in the people over 65, efficacy dropped 8 percentage points to 86%. 86% is still really good. And so they're approved. Their anaphylaxis rate is 2.5 per million. So it's a little bit less than the Pfizer one. And it's slightly less effective with the variants than the Pfizer one. Johnson & Johnson got approved yesterday. This is a chimp. No, this is not the chimp one. That's the Oxford one. This is the Ad26 vector. Single dose, kind of easy to move around. 45,000 people in the first study. They got $1 billion infused into the company. They got $500 million in just blanket support and $1 billion to buy the first 100 million. So this gets a little bit tricky with the numbers here. Now, remember, everything went so fast. The primary endpoint was always preventing new symptomatic COVID. That's the endpoint. You don't see much more than that in the Pfizer and Moderna trials. This one, if you look at everything, it's 66% effective. Now that doesn't sound very good compared to, we're talking about 95%. However, you got to look closer. Multinational multinational clinical trial. If you look at just the Americans, 72% effective. So it's a little bit better. It's still not as good as the Pfizer Moderna. But if you look at, and this is a new metric for vaccines, decrease in severe disease, it's 86% protective, and 100% protective against going into the hospital. That's better than the Pfizer and Moderna one. And no deaths. No deaths in the J&J study. So we got to look at vaccines now as, you know, the original thing to prevent new infections, but we got to get out of that mindset and look at the bigger picture, because we're never getting rid of coronavirus in the world. It's history. I mean, it's just going to become endemic. You want to, your multiplexed quick flu test, you know, you're never going to see flu again. You know, 3 cases this year, whatever it was at the University of Chicago, you know, it's gone. COVID has taken over. It's just easier to transmit. It'll become an endemic disease, and you're going to have these rapid tests, which I'm helping develop, which are really nice, but it's all, like you said, it's going to be all COVID. And COVID it will evolve into this endemic state. So that's J&J. By the way, they have another 30-person study ongoing looking at 2 doses. So that's just with 1 dose. Also, one thing I didn't mention was the side effects are less. Okay. Oxford, AstraZeneca. This is the controversial one developed at Oxford University. This is a chimp adenovector virus. Gives a very broad immunologic response, 2 doses. The US threw in $1.2 billion, 40,000 person study. And this is the craziest one of all with results. They again had a 66.7% efficacy, 81% if the interval, remember I was telling you about the UK, how they were doing all these crazy things? If the interval was let to go longer than 4 weeks and up to 3 months, the longer the interval, the better the people did. So if it was greater than a 4-week interval, the efficacy went up to 81.3%. So, all right, we learn something new every day. However, in South Africa, there's a trial with Novavax, AstraZeneca, and the Pfizer one, and this one did not work. The South African government was going to buy it because it's the cheapest of them. It's $4 a dose, and they had to abandon it and switch over to the J&J vaccine. So for these variants, this may not be a good thing, and people hear this negative news, and so even though the EU has bought hundreds of millions of doses, a lot of people they claim are not taking it. So that's a problem one. I'm not sure they'll get approved in the US. And then there's Novavax that's going to come out in a couple months. This is a glycoprotein nanoparticle with an adjuvant, a special adjuvant, very good. The impact in South Africa, it only works about half the time. So that's the problem. 90% effective in the UK so far. So those are all the vaccines that you're going to hear about in the next couple months. And I think at this point, we should just open it up to questions.
Great. No, thank you for that review. Very, very interesting, and definitely some vaccines I haven't heard about in the news just yet. I guess from the questions that we had coming into this, I'd like to kind of start with just an overview of COVID and how it's transmitted, because I think that would be important to, you know, delineate why the vaccines are effective and, you know, who should get them going forward. So, you know, we've already talked a little bit about the transmission of COVID. Can you speak to, you know, why masks are so effective, why eye protection is so effective, and how the virus actually kind of gets into our bodies?
Why don't you direct the question to either one of us?
Yeah.
Well, let's hear from Dr. Weber.
Sure, and I think, you know, it's really interesting, and you know, Rob talked about all the rigor that's gone into the vaccine development. Thank goodness. I'm always struck when we go through everything, right? Every time you put on the news or go online, you hear something new that probably counters something different from the day before. And, you know, I only half kiddingly say that we'll have this pandemic completely figured out just in time for the end of the pandemic. But the reality is we've come to understand a little bit more about the transmission. And a lot of that knowledge has come from trying to understand the impact of different interventions. You mentioned, for example, Steve, the eyewear and masks or different kinds of masks. So we know that this is a virus that is really projected from the body, particularly so with people who are symptomatic. I'm careful with the language here because you've seen a lot of the conversations about differentiating between droplet, small droplet, aerosol transmission. These were considerations that previously were only of interest to people like Dr. Murphy and me, because the fact is, for all intents and purposes, folks who just think about, oh, it's like the flu, or it's like a cold in terms of getting around. But when we try to pin down and start saying, what are the implications and how we prevent, it makes a difference. And I think but when everything is said and done, I think we're going to come to appreciate is that this is a virus that might project and might carry from individual to individual, more so in droplets than in aerosols, but there is an element of aerosols. And that's significant because aerosols are the part that can stick around in the environment. They can hang out a little bit longer, kind of float in the air longer, and maybe even transmit over greater distances. But at the same time, from a practical standpoint, day to day, as a student or somebody at work or otherwise, you want to know, you're less interested about that distinction about aerosol, droplet, small droplet, nuclear. What you really care about is, how do I protect myself? And I think we're coming to a much better understanding in that manner. And I know folks ask all the time about different types of masks, the rationale in masks. The thing to remember with the mask is that a good part of the value that comes with masks is as much about trying to prevent your own droplets or your own materials from getting out as they are to getting in. And so to that end, you might recall back to the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of conversations about so-called N95 respirators, which we use for the most contagious illnesses in healthcare setting, versus medical grade mask, kind of surgical mask, and the type that you might see worn in an operating room, and then through to including a mask of kind of independent, non-medical construction, ranging everything from, my daughter's Hello Kitty mask to people who are getting, several ply, highly technically developed masks. And the fact of the matter is, you're getting, again, the two benefit, both for the stuff that's launching from you and to a degree what's coming back in when we're talking about out in the community. And I would say that a piece I really try to emphasize now, as people are hearing more about double masks and what now, is the reality that the key has got to be about how that mask fits. It's one of the reasons why folks were wearing the gaiters, kind of the pull up and others. We've moved away from a lot of that because they tend to create these gaps. And I was working with some colleagues out at Argonne National Labs, this highly technical institute affiliated with the government and the university. And they were comparing all these masks, 2-ply, 3-ply, 1,000 count, 200 count thread. And they were talking about the difference in protection being 91 versus 93 and 94%. I remember in one of our later meetings, I said, well, what happens if there's a gap in one of these masks? And they said, well, the effect falls instantly, no matter what kind of mask, down to 50%, 60%. So it's a reminder that for all the stuff that you see, wearing the mask, and again, without getting into aerosol droplet, that having a tighter fitting mask is a good idea. And that's probably the best protection we can do. You mentioned, and I'll finish with the eyewear, Steve, because we know that, for lay people, it's pretty straightforward to think about droplets or infected material being breathed in through the nose or coming into the mouth. But the fact of the matter is, the mucous membranes of the nose, eyes, and others can also be portals of entry. And so you've seen recommendations, perhaps, that certainly in healthcare settings or where folks are actually contagious and bringing this stuff out, that we have taken to wearing face shields and masks, more than just the ordinary eyeglasses, not just because I wear mine on my head for the most part, but really to protect the idea of this material getting around that. And so when I'm in clinic seeing patients or in the hospital, I'm wearing a plastic face shield that's over my, really the extent of my face, in addition to my masks as well. So again, it's a lot out there. But the virus, the transmission, probably the simplest thing to keep in mind goes back to something that Dr. Murphy said, which is it transmits very easily, much more easily than a lot of the other things that we've dealt with. And then to the point that he made about these so-called new variants, those are transmitted even more easily. And that has major implications that maybe we'll get into later on.
Definitely. And in regards to masking, Dr. Weber, can it cause oxygen deprivation? Am I building up so much carbon dioxide that, I can't go for a run and I might pass out in the middle of my run?
I'm glad you asked that. Sometimes, and I cringe to see that in different settings, you'll hear questions and you'll have, one of the so-called experts kind of scoff about, oh, of course. The fact is, these are real concerns that people have. So I'm glad to hear that question. Biologically, this shouldn't make any impact in terms at all of people's ability to get in enough oxygen or get out enough carbon dioxide. The masks themselves are permeable. I'm always reminded, to the extent that we haven't had a spate of surgeons over the last 50 years falling over in the OR because they've lost oxygen. Yeah, if I trust someone to operate on my heart with a mask on, I'll certainly trust somebody to, walk down the street with me or even drive a bus or whatnot. So any question is a fair question with a new disease, but in this case, that wouldn't be a concern. Obviously, there are folks you mentioned about running, exercising. Yeah, there's going to be folks out there who are going to have the experience that, gee, when I try to run with a mask, I don't feel as good. And that may well be the case. It's not dangerous, but it may not give you still some of the benefits that folks like with some of that intense exercise if you're not enjoying it anymore. But as far as a danger or menace, the answer would be no.
Sure. And where should people go to get up-to-date information about some of the changes to COVID, some of the new variants?
This is really, really hard because there is so much out there and so much that's confusing. And I know it's sometimes disappointing for people to kind of go back to the source, or folks, particularly in an environment now where some folks have misgivings about information from the government and that, but the CDC folks do this all the time. And they do this and they've been preparing for it for decades. And yeah, you can get caught in some politics, you can get caught in some bureaucracy of getting material out, but that still is the go-to place for me. I think what they've tried to do, particularly of late, is start shaping some of that messaging so it's more accessible. We have to be prepared and understand that some of that material needs to be translated from a standpoint of not only multicultural, different languages, but also with an eye towards literacy. Rob may have some other ideas and places, but when you're just going to, I need a place that I'm going to be able to kind of settle the bet with my friends about one of these questions, I still direct people to the CDC. But again, maybe Rob has some other sources that he likes to direct his colleagues and patients to.
Yeah, you have to be really careful. We actually just started a group called Vaccine at Northwestern. It's a joint kind of venture between the School of Communication and the medical school. We also have an industry representative in it. We started in December. We've got a website on the Northwestern website at the Institute for Global Health. And it's really been fascinating because it's a mixture of communications people and science, and clinical and basic science. So everybody's out of their box a little bit. Regarding the places to go, it turns out 86% of people actually go to bogus websites or websites with a lot of really bad information. And when this bad information comes out, whatever it is, they flock there. People flock to those websites and they leave the legitimate websites. So the websites that CDC, and CDC lost a lot of credibility, unfortunately, in the last 4 years. Well, that's over. Rochelle Walensky, the new head of the CDC, is an incredible person, incredible infectious disease person. She ran the Mass General unit with 90 ID, Alpha Plus people, and she's doing a fantastic job. And everything, I think CDC, everything's back on course. But the Johns Hopkins website is invaluable. The University of Washington website, their public health website is really also excellent. Our World in Data, if you just want some frank numbers, is highly reputable. The NIH, the stuff on the NIH website, of course, is good, but it's a little bit dense. WHO's website, actually very good also. So there are places to go, but be very careful. The other places are loaded with all sorts of crazy stuff. And, even, I don't know if you know this, but I do a show on WGN every morning at 7:05 a.m. I've done it for 254 days in a row. And we have Facebook questions that come in. And there are some really, really wild questions and accusations that come in every day. Most of them are bots. Most of them are not real people.
Yeah.
And they are spread. I mean, the stations are used to this now. So, they screen through those questions. They find out, like there was some really nasty one that threatened to kill me. And they I don't know, they don't want public health information, I guess. And they said, oh, don't worry, that's coming from Russia, or, that's some crazy don't worry. It's gone. Matter of fact, the user is already gone. They already got, swept away. So all that stuff, it's just incredible what is out there. So be careful. There are legitimate websites. The New York Times has, for the best vaccines data, is the New York Times. New York Times, that's incredible. So there's plenty of good places, but you have to warn people about those bad ones.
And I know there's a broader reach for Resolve, but we should give a plug as well for local information for those who are in the Chicago area. I know our colleagues at the Department of Public Health, both Chicago and Illinois, are endeavoring to provide really up-to-date information, increasingly to try to become a go-to site in terms of access to vaccines and otherwise. And so I wouldn't want to let the moment pass without just acknowledging for those in our area, really important resources and a lot of experts there.
And they're getting criticized because of this rollout. But I think we have to be careful. Let's not kill the goose, all right? They're getting the vaccine out as best they can with the resources that they have. But the main problem, they don't have enough vaccine. If they had a more smoother operation, they'd even have less vaccine because more people would be taking it. And you look at the international numbers, we're number 4 in the world. We're in a good spot. It's chaos, but it's just the way it is. So we have to be careful about, kicking our public health people, because they say, Dr. Ngozi, she doesn't know what she's talking about. And Allison Arwoody at the city of Chicago, they get beat up because there's just not enough vaccine. That's not their fault. They're doing the best.
Exactly. I would just add to that, because for all the uncertainty that folks can feel in the community, that works its way right up the supply chain. We, like our colleagues at Northwestern, we look forward to every Thursday night. We find out how much vaccine we're going to get at the University of Chicago for the following week. But interestingly, go up from there. And those folks that Dr. Murphy just mentioned, Dr. Ngozi at the state is waiting to find out each week what the state's going to get. Dr. Awadi is finding out and that's the part I think that can be frustrating for a lot of us, because there is vaccine out there. We want to get it coming through, but just that idea of being able to predict when it's going to come is important. Imagine trying to drive your car without a gas gauge and being left to wonder when you're going to run out of gas. It's very limiting. And so I'm glad that you said that, Rob, because again, it's easy to beat up some of the folks on the closer to the front line in terms of the government and the public health, but the folks who work in public health are extraordinary and really doing an amazing job through all this in spite of the tough circumstances.
Yeah, we have our public health people, I have to say, are very good. And Ezeki is, worked in underprivileged communities for 15 years. I mean, incredible. And our Woody, was working in West Africa, also in the Ebola thing. These are experienced people. There's nothing wrong with them. The problem is the entire system.
Yeah. Speaking a little bit about the vaccine, Dr. Murphy, you mentioned that both, I believe, Pfizer and the Moderna are mRNA vaccines.
Right.
You mentioned that was a protein, I think, and that creates the spike protein itself in your body that then gets...
It's a messenger. It just tells your body to make the spike protein. Okay.
Are there any other particles or anything else inside the vaccine itself?
It's covered in this nano material. That's just because it's so fragile itself. So it comes in like basically a little shell. Everything kind of dissolves. The whole thing is actually, you can't identify any of the parts afterwards. Also, in all these vaccines, because this is a big issue, is there are no preservatives.
Okay.
There's no other additions. I just went over, we did a report on anaphylaxis recently and looked at all the components, sorbitol 80 and all this, the sugars and stuff. There's nothing in there. I mean, if you're allergic to that, that's probably why some have reactions to some vaccines, but there's no trace metals or anything like that. It's pretty benign stuff. Now, why they're having anaphylaxis, I don't know. And there have been a few cases of ITP, idiopathic thrombocytic purpura, including one death of a physician in Florida. But there's 1,500 of those a year in the United States anyway, and we have to be careful when you're vaccinating tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people. There's going to be a lot of stuff in the background.
Yeah.
We don't want to throw out a vaccine that can save many thousands of lives based on misinterpretation of data.
You know, Steve, whenever I hear the questions about mRNA, in addition to what Rob said, I've come to appreciate there's whole groups out there who get concerned. They hear about mRNA and they say, well, wait, this is genetic materials. This may be getting in and mixing in with my DNA. And these questions usually framed around the idea of some kind of zombie apocalypse. But the fact of the matter is, and I like the language that Rob used, the mRNA is in essence a blueprint for making these proteins. And in the same way that a blueprint for a building is not going to collapse or get into the building, hurt the building, the blueprint gets torn up after it's used. It's used to make the protein, and then that's it. And so the mRNA never gets into the same part of our cells where the DNA is, where our DNA is. So it really just can't happen. And again, it's another place you appreciate the questions and appreciate that, you know, we're making progress in STEM education where folks are starting to put things together in terms of mRNA and DNA and that. But in this case, there's a really strong distinction. And so it's not a concern, as Dr. Murphy already said.
Okay, thank you. And then Dr. Murphy, you also mentioned before that from the various studies, we're looking at certain things that quantify success, you know, either having symptoms after the vaccine, hospitalizations, deaths from COVID-19. You know, what, in terms of the vaccine itself, what kind of drives immunity? And if you are immune, can you get COVID-19?
Well, it's you're actually asking two different questions. So the one question is what these endpoints are different, and the other question is what part of your immunity is protecting you, and is that going to protect you against the future variants? All right. So let's start with the endpoints. What is our goal? We're not going to get rid of this virus is not leaving. All right. And the longer that it stays around, it's going to keep mutating. Now, will it mutate itself out of existence? Probably not. But you know, it can get down to a dull roar. I don't know if it'll ever be as kind to us as influenza. All right. So all we need to do, I mean, 85% of people don't even end up in the hospital, and they stay home, they're sick for 1 day to 2 weeks or whatever. 10% may go on to long hauler type situation, which is another whole story altogether. But what we don't want to do is look what it did to our medical system. Our system basically almost imploded completely, and in some places it did. And that killed even more people because they couldn't even handle, you know, the ICU death rates in New York City in the first peak, you know, was astronomical. The data at the University of Chicago and Northwestern is like less than 15% mortality, even in the ICU. And no difference. I know the U of C numbers and I know our Northwestern numbers, no difference, race or ethnicity. All right, so everybody can do okay if you got all the systems in place. But anyhow, we need to prevent, we've got to be able to be flexible with our standards because we're not going to be able to prevent this disease overall, but we want to keep people alive and out of the hospital. All right. So what about immunity though? This is a big question. You hear so much about antibodies. Antibodies. The commercial antibodies, the only reason you hear about them is that they're dirt cheap to make. They're easy. The test is simple. But it's actually not telling you too much about immunity. The fishing vessel off the coast of Washington, where they tested everybody going in with antibody and antigen, not antigen, but PCR. And you know, everyone had to have a negative PCR. They had 6 people with antibodies. 3 of them got infected when the epidemic happened on the boat. The antibody did not protect them. This antibody that you can measure commercially. Now, I get a question at least every week because now so many people have taken the vaccine. They go and get a commercial antibody test. And they say, my test is negative. The vaccine didn't work. That's absolutely not true. Because the antibody tests are all over the place. A lot of them don't even measure antibody to the spike protein, which is what the vaccines are all about. They're nucleocapsid antibodies. But Roche has come out with a spike protein antibody test, but it may be a different antibody than the antibody that the vaccine is inducing, and they may not measure the same. So I tell people, just don't get those antibody tests. They're not helping you. But there are, you can in the laboratory, we can make antibodies specifically for the vaccine, and Moderna supposedly has. So I'm sure Pfizer probably doing the same thing. So there is nothing regarding efficacy of the vaccine is one thing, but what actually protects you? Antibodies is only part of the story. There's the broadly neutralizing antibodies, which are like a subset of those antibodies that are super powerful. And then there's the whole other side of the immune system that's really difficult to measure. The T cell responses. You know, you can do that in our lab, but there's no screening. There's no place you can go get tested for that. It's all basically laboratory stuff. You know, in some of the phase 1 and 2 studies with the vaccine companies, they did measure that, and they found T cell response. That's probably in the long term more important, but we don't know what we can measure out there in the community. It doesn't exist yet. It is a big goal, but we're not there. So you get this immunity. Now, when you get COVID, can you get COVID again? Well, there's a nursing home in Kentucky earlier this week was reported that of these vaccinated people, after 3 months, they got it again. It was quite a large percentage of the people in the nursing home. This is very disturbing. They don't know the genetic sequencing of the virus yet or anything like that. That was a very disturbing thing. In South Africa, they're finding that people, again, coming in with a second documented bout of COVID with that 351 variant. So the virus is, you know, evolving, and it's basically like the flu. You're gonna probably have to get a booster every year that's updated. Believe me, every company is already re-engineering, retooling their vaccines to cover some of these variants. And that's just gonna be part of life. The Novavax vaccine in South Africa went from 90% efficacy to 50, and the AstraZeneca one didn't work at all. So yeah, we're going to have big problems in the future. And one of the things that has to be done there's two things that have to be done. One is look at Australia, 28 million people, 2.5 times bigger. It's 2.4 times bigger than the state of Illinois. You know how many cases they had today? Because today is already, they're already a day ahead of us. You know how many cases they had today in the whole country of Australia? 7 cases. They haven't had a death for months. It's 7 cases. They don't even have the vaccine yet. They don't have the vaccine. So these mitigation efforts Steve was talking about with the mask and all that stuff, and they're not even wearing masks anymore. That's why they had the Australian tennis open there. But they've got very strict rules that wouldn't, obviously never go over in this country because we're not disciplined enough as a people. So you have that. And then one thing that is completely overlooked is why don't we have like a Tamiflu for COVID? As far as I know, this is actually, my background's really in drug development, not really so much vaccine development, but drug development. So there's 2 nucleosides out there. Merck has one, and a company called Atea has one. The goal is, you get diagnosed just like in your ER. You go in, you get your multiplex test, you get COVID, boom, you take 5 days of one of these 2 drugs, or Tamiflu if you have the flu or whatever. And that has got to be part of this equation too. And I think it's been a neglected part of the whole thing because everybody knows the entire sequence of this virus. There's multiple potential targets against the polymerase, against this and that, and we can have a treatment too. So I think we're going to need mitigation. We're going to need oral therapy, easy oral therapy, and we need the vaccines. We need all 3.
Gotcha. Dr. Weber, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, that says it. And I'm just reminded as Dr. Murphy goes through that, and knowing we're probably coming against time, is reminders we go forward, it sort of changes how we think about the pandemic too. And by no means are we victim shaming around this or that. No one desires to get sick with it. But you move from a time when death from the pandemic is tragic to where it starts becoming inexcusable, where either we failed to get vaccine out, we failed to keep pace with the discovery, or we failed to make the compelling case for folks to be able to adhere to the measures that we talk about. And it's another dimension. You know, there's no difference to lose somebody in the first couple of months of the pandemic or the last couple of months of the pandemic. It's still someone who's lost, and it just compels all of us to redouble our efforts, whether we work in vaccine development, health system leadership, or just in our daily lives of trying to do this right and trying to avoid ever getting back to what we saw over the course of the last year.
There's a question in the chat box about herd immunity.
Mm-hmm.
So herd immunity is when there's the proportion of the people who are immune, they're protected, self-protected, because they've got antibodies or T cells or whatever from getting infected. Every infection we know has some kind of level of herd immunity. Measles is one of the worst because it's so contagious. It's way more contagious than COVID. We don't know. Everyone is just guessing. 70%. Steve, you probably heard 80. You know, you hear everything. I think it's going to be over 90%. Because, you know, the B117, which is much more contagious, has already taken over half of California. It's going up in Illinois. They predict by the end of April, which is, you know, not that far away from now, it'll be the dominant virus here in the US. And, you know, there's going to be other mutations too. So that's why it's like we have two locomotives going down two parallel train tracks. And we've got the vaccine going, we've got numbers going down, although they're a little flat the last few days. And then we've got these variants changing like mad. And you've got these increased numbers. That's what we have to do. So my guess on the herd immunity, it's going to be worse. It's going to be at the worst end of the ranges that they're talking about. As you can, you've only seen 3 influenza cases this year. 3. It's got to be ringing some big bells somewhere. And you're not the only one.
Right.
I don't know. Do you know the national statistics, Steve? I don't know.
It looks like when you compare in past years where flu season like this looks like a straight line.
Yeah.
So it's pretty stunning.
It's really, it's just amazing. That shows you how much more infectious COVID is. If it's that much more infectious, you're moving up into the measles territory, which is well over 90% to protect it.
Yeah.
I mean,
good point.
You know, California, you know, when, you know, everybody had all these, nobody wanted to take the vaccine and they, you know, and everything. They had 14 epidemics. I forgot the year when they were letting people opt out of the measles vaccination.
Measles. Yeah.
And finally, even in California, they actually clamped down and just said, you know, they got it in Disney World, they got it or Disneyland out there, they got all this stuff, and they had to reinforce vaccination for MMR.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there going to be any restrictions or maybe mandates even for people getting the vaccine?
Well, I think there are going to be mandates, I think, and there's going to be vaccine cards, or, you know, there's going to be something going around. They're already talking internationally. It already exists. I mean, you have to not so much show immunity, but you've got to show that you were negative in the last 3 days. If you want to go internationally, anywhere that will let us in, and we're pariahs in the world, you know. So, but if they will let us in, you've got to show you've had a PCR test within 72 hours of arrival. That's very hard to even get. Now, but get ready for the vaccine stuff, and you know, the feds actually don't have a lot of power over the states.
Right.
You know, but if you take the Metro train here in Chicago, if you take the North Shore one going up the north suburbs, guess where it ends up? It ends up in Kenosha. So that's actually an interstate travel. So they can actually clamp a federal law on the whole metro system because since everything is connected. you're going to see stuff like that, to mandate masks, not so much, you took a vaccine, but you're going to have restrictions on what you can do on these kind of patients. And then at some point, it may just be, it'll be like VO, vaccine people only.
Yeah.
You wait.
Yeah,
because it's going to happen.
No, I think it's interesting because I think the social dynamics of accepting the mandatory vaccine for all the reasons that Rob said and some of the experiences, if you left state to state, it'll probably look much like the last few years have looked. I think the other side of it, in terms of that documentation, what we have now, which we didn't have in the past, is really tools by which you can actually retain that information in sort of a credible way, a secure way, where people talk about, if you want to make a reservation on Open Table, well, you need to transmit your vaccine identifier to it, and it's a big area of interest of folks developing. Folks in healthcare know we've endeavored to have interoperability between health systems. The idea of people carrying medical records with them. This would be a discrete single issue about your health that might be needed to board that metro train or to get out. You might have basically a QR code that you have to show that says you've been vaccinated. And I think that's something that, we've never been able to contemplate in the past. The idea of having people schlep around a folded, musty old card was probably not going to really work out so well. So I do expect, and I agree with Rob, that is the way that we see coming forward. And I think we're going to get pretty conditioned to that.
Yeah, if you travel in Africa, you don't go anywhere without this.
Yeah.
And that's for yellow fever. And I've made them put in my COVID vaccine in here. See, it's COVID. I'm ready. But there's even apps now with this.
Yeah.
There are commercial apps you can get for this.
Yeah.
In terms of herd immunity, do you think that either having the actual infection and then clearing the infection and having immunity from that standpoint versus being vaccinated is more effective?
What will happen is that, the herd immunity will be set at a certain point. And then if a new variant comes in, you have to readjust the whole herd immunity. Because your prior antibody or whatever you were measuring or your prior vaccine is no longer valid. So, it may be, okay, you have to have the vaccine, but you have to have a vaccine dated after April 1st, 2021 or whatever, when those vaccines get re-engineered. Believe me, they're all getting re-engineered right now, all of them.
And in many ways, we'll achieve herd immunity not when we hit a number that's predicted by modelers or other experts. We'll know we're at herd immunity when we see that we enter into, Rob described as kind of an endemic state, sort of a steady state of this is what the virus looks like now going forward. So it's hard to predict when that will happen. I happen to fall on a similar range to Rob in terms of being at the higher end, and in part to bake in the idea that we're seeing in California, they're seeing the next wave of the pandemic now. It may not be associated with this as much drama, as much hospitalization. Part of that is greater readiness and capacity. Part of it is just a change in what's happened with the virus itself. But we'll know we get there when we get there. But I wouldn't be able to sit right now and feel good about saying, oh, July, August. It's going to be a while. So I think a lot of the measures that we see right now are proper. But I'm encouraged when I hear people say, well, I like wearing a mask in the winter. It actually keeps my face warm. I think, well, that's good, because that may be something that you're doing in the future every time we get to that season of kind of closing up inside.
Yeah. Just looking through any additional questions. Ihoma, do you have any other questions on our?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Weber, Dr. Murphy. We do have a few more questions from the audience.
Sure.
One related to children. When will children be cleared to get the vaccine, and is it needed?
Rob?
The Pfizer one was already studied down to 16 and approved. They have extended their studies down to 12. There are, if everything that works out, there will be more vaccines down to the lower amount. To put that into any kind of perspective, there was the baby in Washington, D.C., I think, this week, who had, was it 40x the normal? I can't remember. It was multiple
Something
logs
like this.
higher than normally seen in children. So I think ultimately, when they show the safety, it will be, I think they will be used in children, especially as this becomes an endemic disease, just like we give influenza.
Okay.
And a similar question related to pregnant women. And just should pregnant women be concerned about getting the vaccine?
Well, the animal studies were all completely negative. However, pregnant women were excluded from the clinical trials. However, just because they were excluded didn't mean they get pregnant between the first dose and the second dose. And so there have been multiple pregnancies. And now that the vaccines are out there, the official recommendation is talk to your doctor and make a decision. So in other words, there's no recommendation. There are more complications in pregnant women if they get COVID. Generally, they do okay. It's not like there's no birth defects or anything like that, but I mean, there have been some problems. So I don't know what you think, Steve, but I mean, I think that pregnant women should take a vaccine.
Yeah, and I've encouraged both patients and family members who've been pregnant or think of getting pregnant or breastfeeding to be vaccinated for the reasons that Dr. Murphy said. You step back from it too, that we are making a lot of decisions with incomplete information. I was encouraged that for the folks who really think about all the risks and benefits that go with pregnancy and early child development, folks like the American College of Obstetric Gynecology, the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine, who see their charge. I'm not part of those groups, but they see their charge in many ways of protecting pregnant women. For them, they took the position of saying the best way we can protect people who look to us for guidance is by protecting them from the pandemic and protecting them from coronavirus and not from apprehension about complications. So it is, as Rob said, it's always tough because you want to signal that people should make an individual decision. But I think it's very understandable that, even a very well-read, obstetrician kind of, these are hard decisions to make together, but it's something that's worth talking about. But a lot of resources that are out there now. Again, CDC, we actually have we had a town hall that we did now a couple of months ago with a whole series of obstetric gynecology, infectious disease specialists, just to talk and take questions. And I encourage people, you can go through the U of C, the internet there, and you can sit in on that remotely and hear what the questions were. And that was worth noting, that was captured again at a time when we didn't yet have a lot of experience with the vaccine. So far, so good, I think. And again, on balance, if I were asked by a patient, a friend, or family, I would tell them to get the vaccine.
Thank you. And I think most of the other questions that have come through were already answered earlier in the discussion. So I really appreciate it.
No worries. Well, thank you, Dr. Weber, Dr. Murphy, for joining us today. Very, very awesome discussion. I think I learned a lot, even as a physician, kind of going forward. It's definitely going to be interesting seeing the next few months with all the vaccines coming out and people actually getting it. So, I'm very hopeful that things will improve, and we'll see how society kind of goes forward. To all of our participants, please do check your inboxes. For those that registered, we're going to send out a post-vaccine or a post-webinar survey just to get some of your feedback going forward. Students, also check your inboxes. There's going to be just a discussion about the COVID-19 and a little bit more about how it impacts young people. And there's also going to be a raffle for scholarships. So please fill that out, and then follow us on all of our social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. We have handles for all of that. So please do follow.